Hello, friends. Last year, I made a YouTube video about creating a local GraphQL playground in your local dev environment. But unfortunately, I had made some assumption about the viewers. I expected the viewer to know a little bit something about GraphQL. Evidently, that is not the case, and the text on the screen were rather small. So I'm going to start a new series where I introduce viewers who are not yet familiar with GraphQL and how GraphQL works. This video series will be geared towards uh, developers who are not familiar with GraphQL and to management who are contemplating using GraphQL. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's go to the highest level of GraphQL. At the high level, GraphQL is more than just a query language. It's also a runtime for fulfilling your API queries and intentionally mutating your API data via a single post endpoint. All requests in GraphQL is the post request. Um, GraphQL does have some similar concept to OData, but it's not accurate to say that it is the same. So in GraphQL, the client asks the API for exactly what they need and nothing more. The client has the ability to um, uh, create its own query for GraphQL. The clients are not dictated by the shape of the JSON data like in REST. So for example, if you only needed first name, last name, and the route for the GET request contain other superfluous data, that superfluous data is going to go through the wire also, right? So that's increased bandwidth. With GraphQL, you can have a little bit more specificity. So GraphQL has more data types than REST. All of the aforementioned results in bandwidth efficiency, potentially less hits on your database, and upward scalability. Unlike REST, where you'd have every time they add a new endpoint or new URI, this versioning. GraphQL does not have versioning. However, there's a caveat with that, and I'll go into that later. I'm not trying to necessarily sell you on GraphQL. You have to decide whether it is the right fit for your company and your teams. So at the highest level, GraphQL does not have the various verbs that REST has. In GraphQL, there are essentially two root types, the query and the mutation, and we're going to figure out what that means. So GraphQL uses queries for read-only operations. There will be no changes, no persisting changes on the server side. The query is only used to extrapolate data from the server, and then the clients can render that how the client needs to render that. Okay. Now the mutations are what you think of when in the traditional REST model, where you're doing post, patch, updates, deletes, etc. So mutation is again, it's the type of mutation is specified by the client on what data they want to change. We're gonna do. Let's go into a very trivial example, and the trivial example that I'm gonna show you. By the way, this will be. I'll have a link to this in the description to my to a gist. So if you copy and paste this project, I'm presuming that you have Node installed, Node and npm installed on your local environment already. So if you copy and paste this project to your local dev environment, go to the directory where this package.json file lives, and execute npm I, which is shorthand for npm install save, and it will install your dependencies for you. Obviously, that would be in your terminal, right? And then once uh, you have the node modules installed, go to the terminal and go ahead and issue the command npm start, which is described here. It's basically running the node server. And I'm obviously using node. This is going to be on the server side. And then it'll run on port 4000, as you can see here in my terminal. The reason it's on port 4000 is because I specify that here. You can run it on whatever port you want. So this is where I create the server, and I'm using Express. Express, of course, is the library, HTTP library for Node.js. It is the equivalent of, say, Spring Boot for Java or Web API for C#. And so there are no get or delete or post or patch in the GraphQL. There's only post, only one method. Therefore, we have to define a schema in GraphQL. So the schema, for all intent and purposes, is a way to describe the data. Okay, and then you describe the shape of it. Okay, and then you have your resolver. So schema and resolver. The resolver is the logic behind the schema. So in the schema here, I'm defining a method. It will return a string. So every time you query this, it will return a string, right? Now we're going to implement. So it's sort of like the method signature in your base class, right? So once I define a schema, I have to define the logic behind the schema, and that would be in your resolver. And this hello method will return the string hello world. And here it's just standard Node.js Express stuff. I create a server, and then so GraphQL there's only one endpoint. That's the GraphQL endpoint, and there's only one method. That's the post method. And then this is the package that comes with Express GraphQL that designed to work with Express on Node.js. There are various versions for other technologies. Here I'm using Node.js, full stack JavaScript. So for our middleware, we define the schema, which is obviously there, and the root value, which is also referred to as the resolver, right? But you can name this whatever you want, but usually it's referred to as a resolver. And then this thing here, usually pronounced graphical. Graphical is sort of like Swagger. So GraphQL comes with Swagger for you straight out of the box without any DevOps operation. And I'll show you the beauty of GraphQL. Again, it's just like Swagger. And then again, I'm listening on port 4000. Once again, just to prove that that it's running here. Okay, so the server is running, and let's look at GraphiQL. So this is GraphiQL. This is sort of like Swagger, okay? And this is if you go to your GraphiQL and you don't see this documentation here, you just expand it; it'll pop out for you. So since I have defined one query called hello, again let me show you. See, hello right there, okay, and this is schema hello. It's expecting this function here, so it's returning hello world. So we go here, set up my query, and I'm expecting hello, and it has IntelliSense too, right? And then if I click play, it returned my data for me. And from the client side, I can drill into data and drill into the hello key. Okay. Again, this hello is from the schema here and the resolver here, which provide the logic for that schema. Okay, and then this is the middleware where I'm running GraphQL, okay, inside of Node.js. And so if you were to use data from, drill down to data from the client side, okay, so using, let's say, using Vue.js or vanilla JavaScript or React, or even with Angular, if you're using the Angular HTTP library, you can hit the same endpoint, right? It's all the same endpoint, right? It's all GraphQL. There's only one method, that's post. And so let's say you do a fetch on data, and here's what you return back. There's the hello world there, and on front end you can drill into that and get that piece of information from your API, and then you can test this on Postman also, just like you would a REST API, right? So if you update your Postman to the latest version, you're going to have GraphQL here, okay? This option here. And like I said, every single request in GraphQL is a post. So therefore, you obviously choose post, and it's all one endpoint GraphQL. And so if you type in your query here, okay, this query here is the same query as in GraphiQL. You click send. Obviously, I did it ahead of time, and so then you get that back. Okay, hopefully that made sense. I abstracted a lot of stuff to save a little bit of time and not to get too long-winded. Let me see here. Okay, so let me show you real quick. So this is the traditional. So this is a little bit more complex app. So this is the traditional REST model, okay, where I'm going to do a GET request, POST request, delete, etc., right? You define your routes. So this is the traditional REST model. So in GraphQL, it's slightly different. In GraphQL, you only have essentially one endpoint, right? And that's the GraphQL, and here is the middleware. So in a more complex, non-trivial app, the schema is going to be a little bit more complicated, right? But the concept is still the same, okay? And then you need to have the resolver, which is the logic to handle the schema, the type of defined schema, and from there is where your logic lives, and all of your the same ORM interaction is still the same inside of the resolver, okay? And then and then in the app.js file where I'm building the server, there, see, I'm using the schema. Here, this is I'm importing the schema in the resolver, and then I'm injecting that into the middleware down here. Okay, so however, it's not all unicorns and ponies and sunshine with GraphQL. There's some limitation of GraphQL, and one of them is here. GraphQL cannot do binary. So if you want to stream images or upload images, you still have to use REST, unfortunately, at least for the time being. So that leads us to one of the weaknesses of GraphQL. Before I forget, let me show you what the query would look like. So a query the query on the client side would look something like this. Again, the query is used only to fetch data, no changes, no persistence, only to fetch data to render on the client side. And then the mutation will alter the data, right? It's like doing a post request or patch or put or delete. So that's how you would do the code operation, and then just like other in normal client side, server side interaction, you stringify it, you serialize it, just like with JSON. Okay, so that's how you would make the query on the client side. Some people complain that this looked like SQL. Yeah, I mean, I can see that, but it's actually not SQL, right? So only the server would understand this query, right? People seeing this, I guess they can, bad people, I guess they can use that to do whatever, but it'll be challenging. But some people are uncomfortable with that. Okay, so some people are uncomfortable with doing the query inside the client. But it's up to you. There's some really beautiful advantages to using GraphQL, but it's entirely up to you as to what you want to do. I'm going to teach you how to use it, but I'm not going to it's not my job to sell it to you. It's based on your needs. Okay, what else do I need to tell you? Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint presentation. Um, so the challenges with GraphQL is that there's going to be a skills gap in the labor force, right? Because it's a new technology. The front end developer will need to learn the GraphQL language to do the queries because the queries are specific to what the front end needs. So they need to to uh, learn how to write the queries. It's not really that difficult. Um, and here's the other thing too. Even though there's no versioning in GraphQL, anytime that the schema change, the developer needs to understand that it's changed. For example, if this the exclamation point mean that it's required, and you have the string type. So if this change, the string type and the required changes, the front end developer needs to know that because in the on the client side in the request, the data type needs to match, right? Data type needs to match. Otherwise, there will be an error. For example, the string is a required element. So this exclamation point has to be on the request as well. Okay, so the data type and the required has to match up. So that's why I say that um, the front end developer needs to be aware of the schema changes and maybe to some extent the resolver too, if there are changes to that. Okay, and then finally, um, it cannot handle images, unfortunately. So for uploading images, you need to still have a REST, and I think the two can complement each other. All right. So with that, so this is just the prologue, right? Episode 0. In the future, if there is enough interest, if there are enough views and interest, and I will continue the series. I'll make a short series of short videos on how to set up GraphQL on the server and on the client side, and I'll make it palatable to facilitate easy learning. There are a lot of GraphQL videos on YouTube already, but they can be kind of esoteric, and I want to make this for just regular hardworking folks just like you. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye.